Welcome back. I'm Gus, I'm an editor and animator and a visual effects artist. Welcome to episode 9 of Brick Film School, the series where I teach you how to get started on your filmmaking journey. Today we'll be covering camera basics and how to navigate the controls in your camera's manual mode. White balance, ISO, shutter speed, f-stop. What do they mean and how can you balance them to your advantage? If you enjoy or learn anything from this episode, click that like button and consider subscribing. I upload every single week, so you're not going to want to miss it. Also, if you haven't gotten the chance, make sure to check out my most recent animation, The Interrogator. I put a lot of work into it, so if you're interested, be sure to give it a watch. Now, the first thing to mention is my camera's interface may look a little different than yours, but every camera works with these settings that I'm about to show you here. I'm using a Canon T6i here today. White balance. The first thing you'll want to set on your camera is white balance. Tungsten, daylight, cloudy, flash, and so on. You'll want to choose the one that gives you the most natural looking image for the lights that you're using. I'm using warm white LED light bulbs, which basically mimic classic tungsten light bulbs. So I'm going to use the tungsten setting. The wrong white balance will either make your image look too blue or too orange, so play around and see what works with what you have. Just never use auto white balance for animation because then the value will always be changing and you'll get bad light flicker. ISO. The ISO is pretty basic to understand because it's basically just digitally brightening your image, which means the higher your ISO, the more grain you'll have. The other settings we're about to cover have to do with how much light is let into the camera. The ISO is just the computer inside of your camera trying to brighten the image, which can start to break it apart and give you a lot of grain. I would never push my Canon cameras to anywhere beyond 800 ISO for any reason. If possible, I always want to try to keep my ISO at 100 to produce the cleanest image. With live action video, it's very rare that I can drop below 400 ISO. But for animation, I always shoot at 100 because I have control over every setting my camera has to offer, and you'll understand all of that by the end of this video. So a lower ISO equals less grain, a higher ISO equals more grain. Shutter speed. The shutter speed is just that, the speed of your shutter. The shutter is basically a metal door that stops light from hitting your camera's sensor. And when you take a picture, it flips up for a fraction of a second to allow light to hit the sensor. Your camera reads this light data and converts it into a digital image. For live action video, you're going to want your shutter speed to be set at 2 times your frame rate to allow for the most natural looking motion. So for 24 frames per second, I would set it to 50. For 30 frames per second, I would set it to 60. With live action, if your shutter speed's slower, you'll get more motion blur, and if your shutter speed's higher, you'll get less motion blur. With stop motion, you aren't working with motion blur. You can use this to your advantage by really lowering your shutter speed, giving you longer exposures, and enabling you to work in low light situations with a ton of clarity. For the Interrogator, I was working with shutter speeds ranging from 4 seconds to 8 seconds. I most commonly use anywhere from 1 to 4 seconds, but it really does depend on how much light I'm working with in my scene. Also, if you want more depth of field, which I'll explain next. Just a quick tip, if you're working with longer exposures, be sure to let the shutter finish its motion before you put your hand back in the scene, or else you'll get some crazy looking images. So a longer shutter speed equals more light and then more motion blur for live action. A faster shutter speed equals less light and then less motion blur for live action. And this function alone does not affect the graininess of your image. F-stop. Finally, the f-stop is controlling the aperture inside your lens. The aperture controls how much light is let through your lens, and this basically affects your depth of field. Your depth of field is basically how shallow or deep your focus is. Shallow meaning like this much is in focus, deeper meaning this much is in focus. You can think about it in terms of water, like, shallow or deep. A lower f-stop means you will have less in focus, but more light. A higher f-stop means there will be more in focus, but less light. So remember that a lower f-stop equals more light, and a higher f-stop equals less light. And same at the last, this function alone does not typically affect the graininess of your image. So now that you know what all these camera settings mean, it's time to see them in action. Here's our scene, and now let's set the camera. I'm using warm white light bulbs, so tungsten white balance. For animation, I always use 100 ISO. And here's where we take creative liberty. So we're doing a simple day shot. Lots of light, we want a lot in focus. I'm going to find a good balance for the f-stop and shutter speed that works well together to achieve this. We want a high f-stop for maximum depth of field, but now we see our image is a little dark for a daytime scene. So let's turn down the shutter speed to allow light to hit the sensor for a longer period of time. Since we're working in animation, we don't have to worry about motion blur. However, I don't have forever to do this scene, so I don't want to push the shutter to longer than like 4 seconds. So you see, it's all about balancing your camera settings to achieve the look you want with the best quality possible. If you did all you can with your f-stop and shutter speed, that is when you start incorporating your ISO. Just try to keep it below 800, unless you have a very fancy camera, or else you'll start to grain up your image. And now it's time for the Q&A portion of this video. Coming at you live from your local Instagram. Do you use a standard 18 to 55 kit lens or something different? I do just use a standard kit lens. They just come standard with Canon cameras. That's what I use mostly because, I don't know, they're pretty versatile. They can get wide shots, close-ups, and also you can put things relatively close to the camera compared to other lenses. So yes, that's all I use. You don't need anything fancy to do stop motion. And with the tips and tricks I taught you here today, you can really get a huge variety of looks with just that one lens. Is DSLR or webcam better for stop motion? It really depends on what you're doing. DSLRs really do produce the best quality image, but they're really big and it's hard to fit in small spaces. So I've seen animators that have done scenes like in a room and the camera's just moving all around throughout the room. They use a webcam because you can really get really close up and personal with the characters, and they typically have a very wide angle lens, so you get a completely different look. And if you really do want the image to look as nice as possible, I'd recommend the DSLR. It's just another option. There's no like better or worse way. It really is all about getting your story on the screen. So how you get there, it doesn't really matter, but each camera has its benefits over the other. What's the difference between using a prime lens and a zoom lens? So with a zoom lens, you get multiple focal lengths, like, you know, the 18mm to 55mm. That's the standard kit lens. A prime lens just has one. So the most common is the 50mm. That is just one focal length. They're a lot smaller, so you can let a lot more light in using really low f-stops compared to other lenses. But for animation, I would just recommend the standard kit lens because, I mean, at least the 55 I have access to, you can't get the characters as close, and there is definitely not as much depth of field to work with, even with long exposures. You can go very far into lenses, but for now, that's what you get. Okay, and that will do it for the Q&A portion of this video. If you want to be a part of the next one, follow me on Instagram. Also, this will not be the only time I cover cameras, so if you still have questions, never fear, I'll be back. And there you go. I hope this video taught you a thing or two about the world of camera settings. If you have any further questions about this topic or know what you want to see next, comment that below. See you next Saturday on to the next one.